Before I do begin, I'd like to acknowledge the team that is working with me, because it's not just me. We've got Sam Osborne, who's an experienced educator and principal from South Australia, who's working with us in Alice Springs, and Samantha Disbray, who's recently come from the Northern Territory Department of Education Children's Services. We've also got some great students. You've already heard Phil give his talk this morning, which was great, and Patricia Burke, who's been working as a teacher in the Nundarra lands, and we've got Byron, who's working with us across the Interplay project as well. So a really interesting mix of projects in those PhDs, and a great team to work with, and I'm really privileged to do that. I once heard a principal in a remote school describe the remote education issue as an intransigent problem, a problem that won't go away, a problem that's stubborn and is very difficult to deal with. One of the difficulties with that notion, and I hear lots of people say similar things, is that what we sometimes do is we think that intransigence is the student's problem, or it's the problem of families. But what we have come to realise is that we need to think a little bit differently about remote education. We also need to talk differently about remote education so that ultimately we can respond differently to remote education. So we're on this journey of thinking, talking and responding differently about remote education. We come to the project with 4 research questions, and these are the questions that underpin and drive our work. And the first question might seem a bit strange if you come from an urban context and you know what education is about, because it's often about getting people into work, it's often about getting people into further training, it's a springboard to a career. But in many remote communities, the rationale or the reason for education is not quite so clear. And so we ask the question, what is education for in remote Australia, and what can or should it achieve? And second, beyond that, we ask what defines successful educational outcomes from the remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander standpoint. Again, in urban and non-remote contexts, success is pretty clear. It's about things like retention, it's about Year 12 completion, it's about transition into university. But I wonder, and we wonder, what success looks like from a community perspective. And then if we understand what that success looks like, how do teachers teach to that success? And that's a really important question. And fourthly, how can we get the education system to respond to the needs of local communities in remote Australia? We're in the process of gathering our data right now, and that data comes in various forms. We're in the process of doing community surveys, and so far we've done them in 10 different remote communities around the remote area. And we've got Lorraine working with us on that one, which is great. We're also doing in-depth interviews with people on the topics that we've identified before. And what does success look like? What does aspiration look like? We're running a series of what are effectively focus groups with people who are engaged in remote education in one way or another, which we're calling thinking outside the tank. If you haven't experienced one of these yet, we're taking this tool around Australia with us to engage those that are interested in remote education, to give them a chance to say their piece about what they think is going on in the remote education space. We're also using quantitative data sets like My School data and census and other secondary data sources. And recently we've come to an agreement with the Australian Council for Educational Research and Principals Australia Institute to gather data from their collegial snapshot surveys in remote schools, again to get a better understanding of what those communities think about success in education. We've got a very active advisory group who are also providing input, and their pictures are shown below there. People like Andrea Mason from NPY Women's Council, Jeannie Herbert, an experienced educator who has previously headed up Bachelor Institute. We've got Greg Wern, who's been a principal in the top-end community of Yirrkala for a number of years. Howard Bath, the Children's Commissioner. These are top people who are really contributing actively to our work and giving us great input and feedback. So what have we found? Firstly, those questions about success and aspiration don't necessarily apply in remote communities the same way they do in mainstream communities. And in this photo here with Ruben, Sam's actually coming to grips with him about this whole idea about aspiration and success. And his ideas were really quite insightful about the different ways that success and aspiration are perceived in remote communities. Secondly, those deficits, the intransigence, if you like, of the system are not necessarily seen the same way by remote community members. So we often, in the mainstream, talk about educational disadvantage, but we don't necessarily hear the same rhetoric coming from communities themselves. The issue of engagement in learning is to a large extent dependent on culture and community. Some of the analysis that we've done has shown that simply labelling people as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander is not what makes the greatest difference, but their attachment to culture is something that does make a huge difference. Some of the strategies that have been used don't necessarily improve outcomes. We've seen over the last 5 years any number of different national partnership agreements. We've seen closing the gap programs. We've seen all sorts of attempts to improve outcomes in schooling across remote Australia, but not a lot has changed, with some exceptions, of course. But we see that culture and worldview is the thing that does make a tremendous difference, more than distance. So remoteness, even though we talk about remote disadvantage, remoteness is not a key issue as much as culture and worldview is. So how do we want to get people to think and talk differently, and then how do we want to apply the learnings of our research as we go forward? One of the things that we'd like people to think about differently is shifting the focus away from attendance or bums on seats towards real-world learning. So it's often assumed that improving attendance will improve learning, but it's not necessarily the case, and some of our analysis certainly supports that statement there. We know also from our analysis that punitive measures don't work to improve outcomes either. The attention given to trying to get parents and students to comply sometimes just end up in resistance. We also believe that rather than focusing on those punitive measures, we should be rather redirecting resources towards building local capacity and engaging our communities, our remote communities, in the learning process. So, for example, we find that assistant teachers are often undertrained and don't have the skills that they are required to actively engage in the classroom. And we sometimes find that governance structures don't represent the community's interests. So we believe that there are some real opportunities to focus attention away from compliance strategies towards engaging the community and building the capacity of communities. We think that there are opportunities, despite the attention towards getting a nationalised curriculum, towards getting curriculum that will reflect the needs of local communities. So, for example, dealing with things in school that are relevant to local communities. So, for example, negotiating with mining companies, helping students understand how the local politics works and supporting their their leadership aspirations towards governance in their communities. So I think there are all sorts of opportunities for shifting the way that curriculum works in schools. One idea that we've got is to set up two-way knowledge exchanges through partnerships with city-based schools. For example, the solution is often seen in remote communities to get kids out of communities and into boarding schools. And that may work for some students, but we believe that there's opportunities for two-way knowledge exchanges so that students can engage in high-intensity immersion programs for maybe a month in an urban context, but the reverse can happen as well, that non-Indigenous students could come to remote schools to do some learning about what happens in a remote context and learn about Aboriginal culture as well. So there are other things that we can do, like focusing rather on the content of learning, but on building, instead of focusing on content, focusing on the confidence that's required to engage in learning. And a further idea is setting up separate spaces for post-primary students, because we know that the greatest drop-off of students occurs in the high school years, and that one of the barriers to engagement is about the idea of actually engaging in a space that is set up for children. So that, I guess, is a small snapshot of where we're up to with our remote education systems project. It's a long journey, but a journey that I think has the opportunity and presents possibilities to really change the way we think and talk and respond to the needs of remote communities in this really important area of education. Thank you very much.